thank you so much for joining us tonight for our webinar on autistic to non-autistic communication, a two-way street. I think I've met a lot of you on the call before, but my name is Niamh Garvey and I am Director of Operations at As I Am. I have a very easy job tonight. I don't have to do a lot of the talking for once, and I'm delighted to be joined by Adam Harris, As I Am CEO and founder, and our esteemed guest, Niamh Garvey. I'm going to call you an esteemed guest, Niamh. And Niamh is going to be someone who's familiar to lots of people on the call as well, probably three familiar faces in a way. But in case you didn't know until tonight, Niamh is an autistic author who is celebrating the publication of her fourth book. And if it wasn't coming across already, we're huge fans of Niamh's work and indeed Niamh in general. So when we heard she was publishing the Autistic Guide to Communicating and Connecting, we got in touch and said, would she be interested in speaking with our community on the topic? And I'm sure lots of people have attended an As I Am webinar or a parent webinar or any kind of talk on understanding communication differences. It's such a commonly discussed topic within our community, within our sector, but much less so discussed is the fact that it is a two-way street between autistic and non-autistic people. That area, that focus gets a lot less attention, and I think is something so critical to either understanding your own communication or being an ally to the autistic person in your life. And it's something As I Am is certainly hugely passionate on, and we speak about internally and externally daily. And you know, that could be to schools, parents, grandparents, workplaces, public bodies, etc. So it's a topic we wanted to get the chance to really zone in on this evening. And in order to really focus in on it, we're going to have more so of a discussion. So Adam will highlight areas of focus within Niamh's book that we've picked out as particularly critical for our community to hear a bit more on. And Niamh then has the opportunity to expand on those or speak on those rather than write on those. You yourselves will also have an opportunity to ask questions, and you can do so by typing them into the Q&A function. So if you click the Q&A button, you should be able to submit your question there. Obviously, the usual caveat, we will get through as many as we can, and I will also blend some together that are of a similar theme, and that will be near the close of the call. We would just remind people, if questions can avoid just naming any individual, school or service, from a privacy point of view, that would be very, very appreciated. And there is, of course, a limit to how much detail can be given in a webinar answer, and to give a question its due justice. So at the end of the webinar, I'll signpost you to relevant As I Am services that might arise from some of your questions, but maybe where you'll be able to have more of a back and forth chat on that question and be able to give a little bit more context, which can often be pretty critical when you want to discuss something very important to you. So I think that's me done for quite a while. So I'm going to hand over to Adam and Niamh and let them get going.
Thank you so much, Niamh, and thanks for all the work in organising tonight's webinar for a really exciting conversation that I've been looking forward to for some weeks now. Huge welcome to Niamh. As our Niamh, or as I Am Niamh has already said, we're a huge fan of all that you do. You've supported our work in so many ways, both locally and nationally, and I was delighted to have the opportunity to contribute to your last book, which was your anthology of autistic voice in Ireland. So it's great to be marking this, the publication of your fourth book. And tonight we're really going to have a space and an opportunity to delve into that whole area of communication and connection. So we're going to begin tonight by exploring the topic of autistic communication, taking a step back and starting right at the beginning. So I suppose for people listening at home who maybe haven't read the book or who maybe are familiar with the term communication, but the idea autistic communication is something new, it would be great to hear, Niamh, what your take on is when we say autistic communication. What are we overall referring to here?
Yeah, thanks very much, Adam. So communication basically is the process of sharing information. But autistic communication can be quite different because autistic people both receive information differently, process information differently, and share our own information. So there are actually an awful lot of ways that we communicate very differently to non-autistic people, and a lot of people can be quite stereotyped in how they think of autistic communication, and they don't actually realize how vast the subject it is and how many subtle differences there are. Obviously, there's the big difference of whether an autistic person can speak or not speak. But even within that, there's huge variations as to whether someone can speak in certain situations, but not in other situations, or whether they can speak when they're calm and not speak when they're anxious. So there's just huge differences, and it actually begins from when we're born. That a lot of autistic people learn to communicate and develop language differently to non-autistic people, and it's so misunderstood that even after I had done an autism diploma, I had been diagnosed as autistic, I have autistic children, and I had done an awful lot of therapies with them, I still didn't understand why I had developed and processed language differently. And it wasn't until I started my own research for this book that I learned about the difference between, for example, a Gestalt language processor and an analytical language processor. And a lot of autistic people are Gestalt language processors, which means that we learn language in chunks, and we might begin speaking if we do learn to speak, or if we don't learn to speak, we might begin thinking of language in chunks and full sentences, or use a lot of echolalia and copy what we're hearing on television or a nursery rhyme. Whereas most non-autistic people learn their language analytically by piecing words together and forming sentences. So even from then, even from when we're babies and we're just beginning to learn language, and body language and eye contact isn't really coming into it, even back then we're already learning to communicate differently, and it just lasts our whole life.
And you believe, Niamh, that this is the most misunderstood part of being autistic by the general public?
Yeah, I really do. I think that especially in recent years, there's been such an increase in autism awareness, and like, for example, with As I Am, the autism towns committees. I mean, the amount of towns now registering to be autism aware has just exploded. There's so many of them now, and it's fantastic. And I just see autism awareness spreading everywhere. But the main things you see are sensory accommodations, inclusion hours, and social stories, which is part of communication. But in general, there's very little awareness of how non-autistic people can improve the autistic person's experience of communication. And I know it's a complicated topic, and I think that's probably why, because it's so big and it's so complicated, and it's not as simple as saying, if you make a sensory room, it will be more accessible to autistic people, because it is actually more nuanced and more complicated when you're talking about communication. And I also think it's the area of all the differences in autism and within the autistic community themselves. It's the area where there are the most incorrect assumptions, And I so often heard autistic people saying, I'm autistic, but I'm able to speak, as if that categorizes you differently to a non-speaking autistic person. But actually, our similarities between speaking and non-speaking autistic people are actually greater than our differences, And I just think there can be an assumption that an autistic non-speaker automatically has an intellectual disability, but that's not true at all, And we see that now, like, for example, through the work of Fiachra Ryan, the Irish non-speaking poet and writer. I mean, he has just opened my eyes so much. And, we really do need more of those voices. So, yeah, I just think of all the areas in autism, it is the most misunderstood. And it also is the area that is lacking awareness in society the most.
I think it's so true. And I think as well, we've even seen this in our own research, for example, through our Attitudes to Autism poll this year. It's a real area where, because we're talking about an invisible difference, people either simply don't see and don't understand, or very much take the approach of, well, okay, but you still have to learn, or that at the end of the day, there's still a right or wrong way to communicate. So we definitely see that in our work, and I totally agree. How do you think fluctuations in autistic communication can contribute to misunderstanding?
Yeah, I think they really really strongly contribute, even within the fact that autistic communications fluctuate between autistic people themselves, but also within the same autistic person, and what your autistic communication strengths can be one day could be completely the opposite on another day, And for example, there's been quite a lot of research actually into autistic people who are able to speak but choose now to use AAC, which is augmentative and alternative communication. So, for example, they choose to use technology to do their speaking for them, but they're able to speak. But if someone from the outside was looking in at them, they could easily say, "Oh, they're just looking for attention." They're able to speak. But actually, by that person using AAC, it might have a much lower cost to their energy, and it might give them much less chance of hitting burnout. And really, it's not for anyone else to decide you know, if an autistic person has fluctuating communication abilities. It's not for anyone else to decide when they should speak, when they shouldn't speak, when they should use a flashcard, when they should force eye contact. For example, if you're going to an interview, you really are told, I know you find it hard, but for the
Mhm.
interview, you have to make the eye contact. I remember being told that before I ever knew I was autistic, and I remember going into an interview, and one of the interviewers, I looked into their eyes, and I got the biggest sense of doom. I cannot explain why it happens sometimes, but for me, I just feel like a crippling sense of doom from looking into that one person's eyes, and I've no idea why. And there's nothing wrong with the person, but eye contact with that person really, it's like it creates a physical pain for me.
Yeah.
And yet we're told you have to force yourself to do it. So, and also with eye contact, I have no problem having eye contact with my children. I actually love it. But with other people, it can be really hard. So if someone sees me having eye contact with my child, they don't always understand, well, if she can do it with her child, she's only putting on that it's hard if she can't do it with someone else. So yeah, I mean, I just think I do understand that it's hard for other people to see that we can have a fluctuation, because most non-autistic people don't, but they do then if they become really really anxious. And I like, there's no autistic autistic behavior that isn't also normal human behavior, but non-autistic people often don't experience it until they're in an extreme, like, so if someone's in an extreme level of anxiety and they're not autistic, they might find it really hard to talk.
Mhm.
But we can have that kind of every day or all the time or as part of our normal nervous system response. So I do think they have the potential to understand. I do think non-autistic people have the potential to understand it,
Mhm.
but it can just be a harder bridge to cross for them.
Yeah, and I think that it's an interesting area of equality and inclusion, isn't it? Because it requires the other person to adapt, not actually just accept, but actually adapt to
Yeah.
facilitate that acceptance and that affirmation. I think that's really important, because even if we take your example of the workplace interview, we hear so much about things like unconscious bias training, but how much of that actually incorporates neurodivergence or autistic communication? And I suppose in particular now, as we're moving into a more technologically led world, to make sure that there isn't, I suppose, a hard imprinted way in which there's a right or wrong way to communicate. So I think that's really really important. What impact do you think these misconceptions can have on autistic people?
Well, I think the biggest impact is it creates the need to mask, and
Yeah.
masking then I cover a lot about masking in the book, but like, masking has such a huge cost. And it's not just a cost that you go home and you're tired. It actually is known to cause chronic illness,
Hmm.
chronic psychiatric disorders. It really really impacts your ability to engage socially and to hold down a job, and every aspect of your life is affected. And it can also make you you know, it can make you kind of feel embarrassed. Like I have certainly felt embarrassed over my life from knowing someone is misunderstanding something.
Mm-hmm.
But the more I understood and started to reflect on my own autistic communication and also the communication of the non-autistic people, I started to be able to see, oh yeah, okay, this is actually just that we're lacking. There's a mismatch going on. We're not meeting in the middle here, you know? Like I remember being at some event and I was very anxious and I just couldn't speak properly. I knew I could if I really forced myself to. And I was sitting next to my husband and I started texting him what I wanted to say to him. And then I saw the other person looking at me, and I knew that they were perceiving me as being rude, or
Mm-hmm.
maybe they thought I was talking about them, you know. And then I felt, oh God, that's really embarrassing. They think I'm talking
Mm-hmm.
about them. So then I forced myself to speak and go, I'm sorry, I'm just a bit overwhelmed, you know, and I'm just saying this to him or whatever. And it's even like I was in a lift recently, and this family who were from another country came into the lift speaking a different language. But when they came into the lift where I was, they switched to English. And I just was like, isn't that just, you know, it's very respectful. They wanted to make
Yeah.
sure I could understand what
Mm-hmm.
they were saying and I would know they weren't talking about them. But then it made me reflect on autistic people. And sometimes we're just not in a place of being able to say to someone, I'm not doing this to be rude. I'm just doing this because it's a coping strategy. So it can be hard, you know, and that's why more non-autistic people need to become more aware of our communication difference and why we might not want to speak or be able to speak, or we might be trying to reduce masking and speak a little
Mm-hmm.
bit less.
No, absolutely. And I suppose there is that argument that autistic people spend so much of the time adapting. It's these small changes and meeting in the middle that can make such a difference. And indeed can in perhaps make communication clearer and more fluid for everybody, perhaps as well at times. So I
Yes.
suppose when we delve a little bit deeper into the impact of the communication differences, too often the impact of autistic communication differences on others is explained by non-autistic people. And I guess something that's notable about this book is that you're bringing your own perspective as an autistic person. Can you tell us a little bit more about that perspective?
Yeah, I think like I'm a real book nerd and I love stories. And like when you look at people nowadays, you know, we love stories. We love watching TV and we love books, and a lot of our recreation is around stories. And I think we learn best through stories. Um, and when a non-autistic person is explaining something like communication, they can't share the lived experience, you know, and it's not till you really hear a lived experience account of something that you're able to relate to it or see it as something more human and not just a fact or figure, you know, that someone is publishing on a website. Now, on the other hand, I'm not a non-speaking autistic person, and I knew I couldn't write a book on communication and socializing without covering the topic of non-speaking autistic, the non-speaking autistic experience. So I did have to go and do a huge amount of research and
Mm,
interview and read a huge amount. I mean, it just took endless amount of time, but I learned so much. But I really felt I couldn't do justice to the non-speaking aspect of autism, and like 25 to 35% of autistic people cannot speak. So I really felt I needed to do them justice. But I also do have a big sense of imposter syndrome that I speak so much about non-speaking autism and I'm able to speak. So there's kind of both sides to that. I kind of feel like another person also needs to write a book on non-speaking autism. But thankfully the non-speaking voice is becoming a lot louder with people writing more and more and more. But at the same time, I also think that we have to be allies to each other, you know, and speaking people need to be allies to the non-speaking community as well, and vice versa. So yeah, I really just think the lived experience, and even if I can't understand all the lived experience of a non-speaker, I can still understand more of their lived
mhm,
experience than a non-autistic person, because I still get the sensory stuff, I still get a lot of the language processing stuff, You know, there's still a huge amount I can get. So yeah.
No, I think it's really powerful, and I think we only have to look over the last decade, and it was something I actually wrote about in your previous book, The Anthology, to see how that autistic voice has entirely shifted our whole framework, our whole, I suppose, approach to autism, because we've moved the goalposts from deficit to difference, from, I suppose, commenting by observation to actually explaining what day-to-day life is. I think that's so important, and this book is another important brick in the wall in that regard, and I know will make such a difference to so many people. And I suppose it naturally brings us to that topic of double empathy. And I suppose for people at home who haven't heard of the concept of double empathy before, the double empathy problem is a theory. It's proposed by Damien Milton, someone that As I Am has had the pleasure of hosting at our last national conference that he was also a speaker at. And it explains the communication difficulties between autistic and non-autistic people as a two-way mutual issue. It suggests that misunderstandings arise not because one party lacks empathy, but because their different worldviews, ways of thinking, and communication styles create a cultural gap where neither can really easily understand the other. So I suppose, when we talk about it in the context of this book, we often describe an understanding of double empathy by those in an autistic person's life is critical to the quality of life of the autistic person and family. Why do you think that understanding can make such an impact?
Yeah, I think without both people, the autistic person and the non-autistic person, trying to understand where the other person is coming from when they're communicating, if you don't understand it, it will create breakdowns in the communication. And it's just common sense, really, that if two people communicate differently, that if they both try to learn about each other's communication and figure out a way to make a reasonable adaptation and meet in the middle, then you're going to reduce the amount of breakdowns, And I really, really emphasize that in this book, and I really base it off Damien Milton's double empathy problem. But what I am also really clear on is that the reasonable adaptations that either person makes, they can't always be equal, So like you can't expect an autistic person to make all the adaptations. And historically, that's what we've been told to do. Like, not only have we been the ones having to make all the adaptations in order to pass a message and receive a message, but we've also had to hide our own autistic communication difference from the other person. So we're making all the work, we're doing all the work, but we're also masking. And it just has too high a cost. It has to work both ways. Because it's not sustainable for the autistic person to be the one making all the changes. And often, like, I've had really good experiences with non-autistic people to make reasonable adaptations for me, and all they need to do is be told what I need, and then they're very willing to do it. But if they're not told, they don't know, and, like, for example, I was on a parents association for a few years, and I expressed, guys, I really find it hard to go and talk to people about fundraising and to ask people for fundraising. I just clam up and I get really anxious. But I do loads of work behind the scenes on making inclusion hours and social stories, and like the chairperson said, "Oh God, just don't do it. You're exempt from that. You're doing loads of other work, and we'll do that." And that was just such a simple little thing that meant I was able to continue in that committee for 3 years because I knew I wouldn't be forced to do things that made me incredibly uncomfortable because I'm autistic. So just having that little bit of meeting in the middle from both people, it really does help.
And it's about that complementarity as well, isn't it? That in terms of the work that you were doing, for example, in that PA, perhaps the person who was good at the fundraising couldn't do. So we need different minds, different communication preferences, different strengths to maximize for the best. And I suppose, are there any other examples in your own life where double empathy has supported your quality of life?
Yeah, like there's absolutely loads of them. Like one really simple one, which now, like, was between me and my stepmom, and when I was growing up, my stepmom used to always be saying, "Look at me in the eye when I'm talking to you. Look at me in the eye when I'm talking to you." And I used to force myself to look at her and then look away as soon as I'd counted 8 seconds or whatever. And it was only when I got diagnosed with autism that I said, I really find it hard to look you in the eye. And she was like, "What?" So I just presumed she knew that I found it hard to look in the eye because I thought everybody did. She thought I was being rude
Mhm.
or trying to show her that I was bored or uninterested. So we both had a completely different understanding of what the other person expected,
Yeah.
and that was such a simple conversation, that she told me, if you don't look people in the eye, people think you're bored or not interested or you're rude or you're not listening. And that had never occurred to me, like that she would think it my own, my mom. Like I understood it outside the house, but it didn't dawn on me. So all we needed was one simple conversation and the whole problem was fixed. Or another one I used to do, and again, this is years before I knew I was autistic, was I process information through writing. So when I was like a newly qualified nurse, I always carried a notebook in my pocket, and whenever any I would ask someone to explain something to me, like how to use a new machine or how to make up a medicine or whatever, I always took out my notebook and would write it down. And it became like so famous, like that when people would come to me like, "Oh, check Niamh's notebook," or they'd say, "Oh, Niamh, take out your little notebook now. I want to explain something to you." And no one knew it was because of autism, but people recognized that I needed to write something down in order to process and make sense of
Mm.
it. And there was no problem, like there was no issue made around that. It was a simple accommodation for double empty to be shown to me.
No, it's such a powerful. They're two very powerful examples, and what's interesting is both of them are kind of in that domestic or familial context, whereby you can hopefully have those conversations, and one conversation can make a huge difference. And I suppose thinking of the time of year that we're in, as we're seeing schools reopen around the country, as people are getting back into routines, I think what's really important about this conversation is so often that lack of understanding can actually be institutionalized, where, for example, you're told in school you must make eye contact with the teacher. You're told in the workplace you must communicate in a certain way. And if you don't, there's very real world consequences for that. I think that shows the real importance, not just in terms of education, but actually in terms of making sure that there's protections for autistic communication, and that we're not talking about charity, we're not talking about a nice thing to do. We are talking about people's fundamental communication rights. And such a small adaptation, such a small meeting in the middle can really make such a huge difference to a person's quality of life. And I suppose that brings us quite nicely into a theme that you explore a lot in the book, which is the whole area of reasonable adaptations. And you speak at some length about this in the book in a really wonderfully practical manner. And you speak about reasonable accommodations specific to all sorts of communication differences. And we'd love to go through them all tonight, but I don't think we'll be able to do that. But maybe you'd be able to give us a couple of examples of helpful, reasonable adaptations in your own life when it comes to communication.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I so many examples. So for example, one thing that I have implemented is I like a lot of autistic people, I have a very monotropic mind. And a monotropic mind means that you sort of get into these tunnels of focus and you find it quite hard to come out of the tunnel of focus. And one of my biggest challenges is coming out of what I'm focusing on and being able to communicate. So when I work from home, obviously, because I write.
Mhm.
So when I'm working at home, if someone wants to communicate with me, I will find it really hard to switch from focus to communication. So I began with my husband trying to come up with some sort of how am I going to help myself around it. So what we came up with was he comes in and says, in 5 minutes, can we have a talk? And I say, yeah, no problem. And then that gives me 5 minutes to sort of tie up my thoughts and come out of
Mhm.
the focus tunnel. And then I'm sort of sensorily grounded. I'm out of my focus. Usually I realize all the alexithymic things I didn't realize, like I need to go to the toilet and I need a drink of water because I didn't feel all these body needs that were going on because I was writing for 3 hours. And then another way I adapted that was with my children, because obviously I'm not going to ask a young child to say to me, tell me you need to talk to me in 5 minutes. That's not going to work, especially when my kids were toddlers. But I did really want and need, actually, I needed them to be able to work with me on this. So the first thing I did when my kids were very young was I taught them that when you want to speak to me and I'm focused on work, you just put your hand on my wrist. And I will give them some symbol that I am aware that they want to speak to me. I can't wait 5 minutes, so I have to kind of tie up a little bit quicker. And I might just say one or two lines like, I'm nearly done, or I'll be with you now in a moment. I know you're waiting very patiently. And then when I'm as ready as I can be within the time frame that they can wait, depending on their age, then I switch focus to the child. Now, one of my kids is ADHD, so she finds that much harder because she gets a thought in her head and she wants to just say it immediately. So what I worked on with her was that she can put her hand on my hand, or she can use the visual timer. I actually keep a timer on my desk, and they can visually, put it up to 3 minutes or whatever I've agreed with them. But she's allowed to tell me what she needs to say. So she goes, I need to speak to you about blah, 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 blah. And then she knows she has to wait the 3 minutes for me to engage in the conversation. So because she couldn't wait those 3 minutes, that would be pure torture to her. Now that she's older, sometimes what I say to her is, go write down what you need to ask me and come back in the 3 minutes, or I'll call you when the 3 minutes are up. So that's an example of how I had to make different adaptations with all the different people in one family. It's not always one adaptation fits all, because you also, that's me having empathy for the different people in my house, but it's also them having empathy for my need to come out of my tunnel of focus. So that is just double empathy working in everyone's direction. So my kids have grown up knowing this about me. It's not a problem. It's not a rejection. They know they'll get my 100% focused attention, because I'm not still half my brain in the thing I'm working on and half my brain on them. I need to be all or nothing. I'm not good at being a little bit here and a little bit there. So that's probably a very big example. Sorry, I went on a bit long, but yeah.
No, it's an amazing example, and I can so relate to that challenge of transitioning from the work communication to the home communication and just needing a time between the two, because there is nothing worse when you come in and trying to actually take in that information when your mind is just not quite able to do that and is quite not moved from the previous task. So that's something that I battle with and try and work around myself every day. And I suppose as well, it's interesting, again, touching back on the double empathy piece. Again, we see an example here of autistic communication, not just adapting to meet the neurotypical communication styles, but indeed actually adapting to meet other neurodivergent neurotypes and communication preferences as well. And I suppose what's interesting is so much of this has probably been instinctive trial and error, survival. But what's interesting in the project that you've done is you've had a chance to research all these different adaptations that have worked for different people. So in doing that research, have there been any new adaptations you've trialed successfully or unsuccessfully?
Yeah, there actually have. I've tried a lot of them because I got quite fascinated and very obsessed when researching this book. So I actually even tried. I tried AAC. I tried a free AAC program called Weave Chat, because I didn't want. They're actually really expensive. I was really surprised by how expensive some of the AACs are. So I tried this free one for Weave Chat, and funnily, I could see how it would benefit someone, but it wasn't for me. And I'm extremely bad on computers. I'm a really untechnical person. And even something as simple as, finding something in a folder, I could be told how to do that 50 times and I still can't remember how to do it. So navigating the AAC screen for me was quite hard. But funnily, I had it open, and then one of my kids who's able to speak came along and started playing with it. And I mean, she had it in 5 minutes, and she began using it for when she was overwhelmed. So I just found that interest by me modeling it and using it for myself. she actually started using it and loving it, and that
Wow.
really taught me, oh, I would never have thought to use AAC for her because she can speak. Um, but actually, AAC can be so good for people who can speak, but who it costs a lot for.
Yeah.
So that was really interesting. But what I did learn was from doing that, I decided, okay, the AAC of an actual AAC program isn't what I need. But what I did start doing was just keeping notebooks all around the house. So if I was overwhelmed or if I am overwhelmed, I might just write it out instead and give my family member to read it. And the other one I did was I got the Jam flashcard, the
Oh yeah.
JAM Just a Minute
Yeah.
flashcard. And that was free actually. You can just email them, I think, and you get one for free. And there's all different Jam flashcards. So the one I got says, I am autistic, please be patient. And I keep it in my wallet. And I've only ever used it once when I was really overwhelmed at a counter. Some counters, I think it's Aldi or Lidl, they start this incessant beeping when they're waiting
Mm.
for you to pay, and it just spirals me completely. I really get stressed, and I couldn't cope. I couldn't even think how to pay, so I showed them that card, and they said, "Yeah, no problem, take your time." And then I was able to just gather my thoughts and pay. So although I've only used it once, the fact that I have it in my wallet has really helped me knowing that it's there for if I do become really stressed. Sometimes just knowing you have an adaptation at your hand
Mhm.
is actually enough for you to not even need that
Absolutely.
adaptation. But it's like a comfort blanket. It's there if I need it, but I
Yeah.
might not need it. But yeah, I just think the jam cards are fantastic, and they're really it's a flashcard basically, but they're really well recognized, and
Yeah.
same with
Yeah.
the sunflower lanyard. I find I
Yeah.
often use that, and that's also a form of communication. That is me communicating to people around that I have a hidden disability and I
Mhm.
want more time or I want more patience. So, I started using a lot of those sort of symbolic things, and they've really helped.
That's really interesting to hear, and really positive to hear as well. And I'm conscious, you've given some examples there, reasonable adaptations that have worked for you for a long time, and new ones you've experimented about or heard from other people through the course of the research that you've done. There might be many parents on the call tonight and they're listening to this and they just don't know where to start. They feel lost about what reasonable adaptations should I even think about implementing. Of course, you can only speak to your own experience, but what are some reasonable adaptations you wish had been put in place for you when you were younger?
Yeah. There's a lot really. But I think the most important thing is for each parent to look at their individual child and see what their strengths are and when their strengths fluctuate. Because some people, can assume that when your child is at their best strength of communicating, that's your baseline. But actually it's not, you need to bring down your baseline to somewhere between when they're at their highest strength and when they're most challenged, and consider that baseline and what you can do to help them stay at that baseline or above. And I think from this research, one of the things that stood out to me hugely was a lot of autistic people felt that there was much too much emphasis put on them learning how to speak,
Mm.
and that actually a lot of them wish they had been given opportunities that had nothing to do with speaking, and that
Mhm.
their parents tuned in more with their non-verbal communication and gave them things like AEC a lot earlier. And there was a misconception for a long time that if you give a child AAC, they
Yeah.
then won't develop speech. And actually, there's still a lot of speech therapists out there who are telling people, oh, no, 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 don't give your child AAC, then they won't learn to speech. But
Mhm.
actually, what research has found is the opposite, that when you're
Mhm.
opening communication pathways at all, it's, more and more will develop because the child starts to realize, oh, when I communicate, I get a response, or I might get my needs met or my desires met, or people engage with me. So the more methods a child has to communicate, whether that's having flashcards around the house, whether it's having a visual plan or a visual of emotions and they can point to their emotion, or having AAC, the more there are around a young child, the more likely they are to develop multiple communication methods that will have their needs met. And it is ultimately about having the child's needs met and not the parents' needs met, you know. And that can be hard as a parent. Sometimes I can be like, oh, I just want them all to do A, B, and C for me. But actually, I have to stand back and go, okay, they have different needs to me. And ultimately, meeting their basic needs every day is my ultimate goal, you know, that they're fed and that they're watered and that they're alive at the end of the day. And I think another one that really, really actually stands out to me is because I'm a Gestalt language processor, and I did learn to speak in chunks. And as a child, I often left out words, okay? And even now, if I'm quite stressed, if in my head I'm thinking I want to go to bed now, the words that might come out are bed now, and I've left out I want to go to, okay? But when other people speak to autistic children, they often replicate that and leave out the words as well. And that's a real pet hate for me, because if someone leaves the words out, I then have to fill in the gaps of the words they're leaving out. So they think they're actually helping me by reducing what they're saying. But actually, then I'm going, well, what are the other words that they were thinking? Because I don't know them. I only know the words I'm thinking when I'm leaving words out. So that to me is a real one I have to remember. Like, and one of my daughters, you know, for example, one of her gestalts was if she wanted to go on a slide, she used to say, ready, steady, go. So if I only said to her, ready, steady, go, knowing that that meant she wants to go on a slide, it's not actually helping her learn more language of, you know, the word slide or anything like that. So I tried to say, ready, steady, go, you want to go on the slide, you know? And just when they're using a gestalt, you can actually expand on that, and try not to just stick to your child's gestalts, because like that really used to confuse me as a child when other people copied, and they were doing it out of good intention and they were trying to help me, but actually it just confused me.
Yeah. And it just shows good intention only gets you so far, and that's where knowledge really is power and so critical. And
Exactly. Yeah.
you know, so much more needs to be done to open up this conversation beyond our own community. And I suppose so much of what you've said there brings us into an important point that I think we've touched on throughout the interview, but I think it's worth creating a space to address explicitly, which is we have a community that people so often throughout the history of the autism community have tried to tidily segment. And of course, we know that often doesn't work. And that's not something that you do in that book, because you deliberately do not separate communication methods into methods for speaking autistic people and methods for non-speaking autistic people. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about why you made that decision or took that approach?
Yeah, I really dislike when people categorize autistic people into those who can speak and who can't speak. And it comes from both perspectives, because if, you know, people who say, oh, you're a speaking autistic person, therefore you've mild autism, you're actually all right. But actually, you can be extremely challenged in your daily life and be able to speak. And then there can be someone who can't speak, who could have a really good quality of life, but on the other hand, they could also be missing out on a lot of chances that a speaking autistic person can be given. And I remember at the ITACOM conference a year or two ago, which is a big conference for autistic voices, there was a non-speaker, and something he said, he didn't say it, but his AAC said it, as in logic, literally, as he said. But it was that he's deemed too autistic to engage in programs for autistic people. And I was like, what? So he said he can't speak, he can't control his body movements because he's got apraxia, which is a motor control condition where your body would just keep on moving and you can't actually control it. He couldn't speak, he couldn't control what words came out of his head, and yet he's got a PhD. You know, he has no intellectual disability, and he as a child and all his teenage years, he was deemed too autistic to do any autism programs. I just think that is so bad. You know, I think no matter who you are, if you're autistic, you need to be able to do all the programs, and it's up to the organizers to find an
Absolutely.
adaptation to let you go. Whether you need massive help with your daily life, whether you need someone to help you with your communication, you can't exclude someone because they can't speak or because they can't control their body. So his words really impacted me in a huge way. And I was researching the book at the time, and that was really a light bulb moment for me, going, oh my God, like, how could those people who are so completely one of us, they are completely an autistic person, the same as us, who can speak and who can advocate and who can hold a webinar and speak for other people. We have to be their allies if they're not even being given the chance to
Absolutely.
communicate. And so many non-speaking autistic people have told me that they're just assumed not to need to learn, or they're assumed that they only need a basic level of education and they don't need to learn how to creatively express themselves, or that they're assumed not to be able to study, history or geography or science, and they're just given those basic education. And it really infuriates me, because until they are able to fully express themselves through a communication method, nobody can know what their level of intellect is. And also, for the autistic people who do have an intellectual disability, they're no less autistic than someone else, and they're also just as valid as a human. They're no less important. So I just really don't like the categorization and the segregation and level 1 and level 2. Like, we're all autistic, we're all in this together, and we really, really need to be allies to each other,
I think that's so important, and particularly at a time where we're seeing a spread of misinformation around autism, where we're seeing a hardening narrative around the world, which is trying to categorize autistic people, which is trying to undermine autistic experience. And of course, that very often it is completely absent of autistic voice. I think it's more important than ever that the community cooperates as one. And I suppose when we talk about rights, and we so often talk about the right to education, or the right to healthcare, or the right to social protection supports, the most fundamental right is to have your voice heard in whatever way that person may choose to communicate. So it's such a fundamental right that we can't lose sight of, and in which we've still such a journey to travel towards realizing. And I suppose that probably lends itself to, we're talking about how important communication is, but you're an accomplished author of numerous books about autistic experience. I'm sure many, 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 many more to come. But what brought your focus to communication specifically, and why did you choose to write about it now?
I think I started researching it sort of by accident, without an intention, because I actually, my first book was called Looking After Your Autistic Self for adults, and I focused on emotional and sensory regulation. And a lot of people asked me, oh, I'd love if you did more on the social experience and socializing. Now, I did cover it a bit in the book, but only through the emotional and sensory lens. So I said, okay, I'll start looking into writing a book on socializing and how we can become more comfortable at social events and with social engagement. But when I began to kind of think about this, I realized, you actually can't write about socializing without writing about communication, because the two things go hand in hand. And, when you're looking at the criteria to get a diagnosis of autism, you know, communication and social interaction are two big defining features of autism. So you have to really understand them. And I really started thinking about my own communication, and I thought, I don't know, do I really understand my own autistic communication? Because, yeah, I understand a lot about autism, but I don't really understand all. I certainly didn't have the language for it. So I started researching it, but I mean, like, research was few and far between when it comes to autistic communication. It's an area that's really neglected in research, particularly the non-speaking experience. It's like trying to find water in a desert, trying to find articles that are neuroaffirming.
Mm-hmm.
And what really struck me actually was that, like, 50 years ago, uh, there were people writing about Gestalt language processing, Barry Prisant and Marge Blanc. They were writing about Gestalt language processing and autism, and in a quite neuroaffirmative way as well, But it was all just pushed under the bridge because ABA, which is applied behavioral analysis, which was kind of a method of educating autistic people by making them act more non-autistic. But ABA just sort of took over research, and it took over everything. And all this beautiful research from 50 years ago kind of got neglected. And now it's being talked about again, and only really in the last 2 or 3 years. And that infuriates me that it was there all along. And how far could we have developed by now had that stayed in the social consciousness, you know? So really that's kind of how the communication came about. And the more I planned my strategies for socializing, like really the book is kind of all working up towards what I call the 6-step social plan. And that's it's a whole plan of 6 main steps you take to be able to socially engage and to do things, social events and stuff. So I was working towards that strategy, but I then ended up writing like 2/3 of the book becoming dedicated to communication for me to get to that plan. So it all was really unexpected. And like this book was supposed to be short at 50,000 words. I had to go back to my publishers and say, I'm sorry, it's now 90,000 words. Do you mind? It's literally double the size. But they were really understanding. They were like, okay, we actually don't have another book, you know, so similar to this. And they also realized what an enormous subject autistic communication actually is. It's just vast, you know.
Totally. And just to say, we are approaching the Q&A section. So if people have questions, very much encourage you to put them in the Q&A box. But also, you've given us a flavor there, Niamh. You've planted the seed around your 6-step social plan. So we'd love to hear about that before we go to the Q&A section.
Yeah, like I don't have time to really go into it, but like basically it's just 6 steps that I have found from all the research I've done that people can consider these 6 steps in order to prepare themselves for social engagement. So the 6 steps are predictability is the first one, and that means, you know, telling the autistic child or knowing yourself the who, what, where, when, why, and how. So who's going to be at an event, what's going to happen, where it'll be on, why it's happening. And that's really important, because if you don't know the why, you don't know, you know, is it a birthday party? Therefore, I need to bring a present. Is it a party? Because I've seen so many autistic kids turn up to an event and they'll be like, oh, I didn't know it was his birthday. And you're like, that's why we're here. Nobody told you the why and the how long for. The next step then is meeting your basic needs before you go. And that would be huge for me, that if I have not met my basic needs of having enough to eat, having enough to drink, having enough rest, I can't communicate, you know, I can't socially engage, or I'll do it to a much lesser degree. So I go into that quite a lot in the book. Then I have these 2 things called habits, the helps or hinders habits for communication. And that's about getting to know what helps you communicate, what hinders your communication, and what can be done about it. So I do give a lot of examples, but I don't have the time to go into them all on this call now. Step 4 is the helps or hinders habit for socializing. And again, it's what helps, what hinders, and what you can do about it. But it does require a lot of self-reflection as to get to know about your own or your child's challenges and strengths around socializing. But I really do think that getting to know your own strengths and challenges is very empowering, you know, because you can put strategies in place. And then the last 2 steps, one is sensory supports. Sorry, I'm just dropping my stimmy stone there. Sensory supports, and then a recovery plan. I wouldn't go to any social event without a recovery plan, so I know what I can do afterwards to refuel. And I'd never go from one social event to another, to another, to another. I have to have time to refuel between them. So that's it in a nutshell. But that, I know it's too big a topic to talk about properly. I'm sorry, Adam, but
No, well, I
it
think
is
now sounds like
in the book.
well, before I hand over to Niamh, who's going to ask us some questions, which I can see are coming in hot and heavy. A very obvious question is, people have gotten a flavour. I know people want to learn an awful lot more. When is your book out, and where can people pick it up?
So it's already published. It was out last week. It's available. It probably won't be in all the shops. You can buy it online on Eason's and Outside the Box. actually have a whole section for all my books. I know they'll actually be at the EU Autism Congress, so they'll be selling it there. And there'll also be a discount code sent out for people who've attended this webinar if they want to buy it directly from the publisher, Jessica Kingsley publisher. But most Irish shops, Dewberry, Eason's, all of them, they all have it online. But if you want the discount code, the Jessica Kingsley publisher have shared that for attendees to this webinar.
Thank you so much, Niamh. And I might pass to, as I am Niamh now, who's going to take over with some questions. But thank you for a really great conversation and for sharing with us so generously this evening so far.